Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining today's in-service. I guess I should say the videos. So we're doing it a little different this year, as many of you are noticing. We have a series of videos to share with you, so you can watch them at your own leisure and availability. And we just couldn't find a time when we could offer everybody presentation with some slide as a preview to what some of our winter meeting content will hold. And so we wanted to get that in your hands as soon as we can. And as you may have seen, our extension plant pathology team is offering a discussion session live coming up on Tuesday, December 16th at 3 p.m. Central Time there in the afternoon, that you're welcome to join, ask questions after you've watched these videos, or maybe before if you had some burning questions you wanted to get answered. And so then you'll also, in addition to these videos, have access to all of the PowerPoint content. And I know for myself, I will continue to change my PowerPoint slides and update those. And I'll tell you more about that. And so please feel free to tear those apart, edit them, use them as you need for your local trainings. And so if you have any questions ever, please reach out to me or one of the other team members that are presenting. So thank you so much for helping get some of this content out there. And so I'm Tamara Jackson Zims, your extension corn pathologist. I also cover diseases of grain sorghum, but I rarely talk about them because I just don't see a lot of important diseases. But there is one this year I want to bring up and make sure that you're aware of. And so this is going to be the corn and sorghum disease update. So the main thing I want to start off with is, why in the world did all this happen in 2025? And we certainly have had a historic year in a lot of bad ways when we start thinking about diseases of corn and crops in general. And I want to touch on that so that we have a kind of a general understanding. And so when we look at the year we've had, and then we start looking across the state, I think I would divide the state up into thirds and look at the eastern, central, and western thirds of the state. And so depending on which counties you're covering, what part of the state you're in, you may have different interests. And so just to give you an outline of what to expect in my content and the corn disease content in general, mostly for the easternmost counties in the state, I'm going to focus and start off this presentation with some content about southern rust and why this happened to us, why it was so severe this year, because it was by far the worst disease in the eastern third of the state. But that's not to dismiss that we had substantial tar spot come in, especially later in the season, and talk about that a little bit. Now, in the central part of Nebraska, you're seeing tar spot building up there too. And so that was significant in a lot of those central Nebraska counties, and it's continuing to move west. And so I'll talk about that too. And then finally, in the western part of the state, and honestly statewide, but especially out west, we saw more crown rot this year. And I'm just going to mention crown rot at the end. And then I'm going to refer all of you to some supplemental videos from 3 of my students in my team. And 2 of them are educators or instructors now and team members of yours. And so they'll be sharing research results from some of their own master's thesis research and one of my PhD students as well. And so I recommend that you see those supplemental videos to learn a little bit more in depth about what's the most current research we have on that. Tal and Muse will talk about tar spot and irrigation interactions and what we can expect under our irrigation pivots. And Chris Tremundi and Chakoti Makuma will talk about crown rot and some of their most recent research. But I want to put in a quick plug too, because we also have seen more ear rot diseases here at the end of the season of 2025 that I'm betting a lot of people were unaware of and may have had some pretty bad surprises, maybe when they got to the elevator. And so a lot of those ear rot diseases are a result of some of the earlier season diseases and the conditions that led to make those worse than normal. And so ear rots and grain molds, even while in storage, could continue to get worse. And I want to raise awareness about that. So we want to continue that dialogue through the winter months. And especially as we have fluctuating temperatures that could lead to some condensation development inside our grain bins and worsen some of the grain molds. And so from some of the worst affected grain, I hope that that is sold more quickly or used more quickly. And depending on what those are, there may even be some mycotoxins there too. And so grain quality, how we use that grain, may depend on what exactly is there and how it's going to be used. And so we have to be more careful with certain animal species and the younger ones, especially like cow calves, or especially other species like swine and some other species that are more sensitive. So let's move forward and talk a little more about southern rust, because that one's going to be the most important to us. And so this is the map that now has been moved to the Crop Protection Network. And so this is what it looked like at the end of the season across the country. And some states vary in how they deal with this. And so here in Nebraska, we're really trying to be proactive. We want to keep this as updated as much as possible, because I feel that this is a service we provide to make sure people know where we're finding it in the state. And so we're working hard to try to get samples, let people know where it is, so that they can make their own decisions about how to handle treatment and that we don't have surprises. And so we really ask that you let us know if you're starting to hear about southern rust in the area, or if you need help identifying it. That can be really quick for several of us to do. We've got some microscopes scattered around the state, and under a compound microscope, we can tell like that how very quickly which rust disease you're looking at. And we care because southern rust is caused by a more aggressive fungus, and it has the potential to cause some serious yield loss, as you saw, because it can increase quickly when conditions are favorable. And we'll talk more about that. The main conditions being temperatures around 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, whether that occurs during the nighttime hours or daytime hours, it really doesn't matter. What does matter is how long is it going to be about that temperature. And for prolonged conditions where we have high humidity or wetness, whether that's from the pivot or rainfall, that's going to drive that. And this fungus can increase quite rapidly. And so as temperatures start to cool down as we get toward the end of the season, southern rust will slow down too. But unfortunately, that may kick up some other problems like tar spot. And so you'll notice this map, there's a lot of what I call human factors. This fungus blows in every year from locations south of us, south or southeast. And so we really depend on their reports to know what might be heading our way. But there's no incentive for them to report southern rust because they see it every year. And so in states like Texas and Louisiana, even Oklahoma, they may have the disease and not be lighting up counties. And so historically, we've often reported it even before Kansas sometimes, because we have so many excellent crop consultants and other agronomists out there that can recognize it and are looking really hard. So please communicate with us, and we'll work hard to get your samples identified and your counties colored on the map if you're seeing it. Some of you might have seen an article that I worked on back in October to get out, back in October 23rd, it looks like. I called it Mythbusters, the Southern Rust Edition, because by harvest, I had started to hear a lot of rumors, and a lot of the things I was hearing around the countryside, so to speak, were actually untrue. And I think it was our clientele's effort to try to explain just what happened, because it was so terrible in the eastern third of the state. And so a lot of them had also been misinterpreting some of the scientific information that's online. And so that's a bit of a guess on my part, but some of the things going around were absolute lies. And a lot of it was to try to help people understand what happened, but maybe some ulterior motives in some other ways. And so I felt like it was critical to get this article out. And you may have heard other myths or rumors going around. And if you do, maybe we need to add to this list. Let's talk about it. But hopefully this helps you address some of the things, conversations that are happening around there and some of the questions you might be getting. And so just to go over some of the content from that article, a few of the main points. The number one thing that I've been hearing is, and this is because not only did we have a lot of southern rust in 2025, in some parts of the state, especially up in that northeast corner up here where I live, we had a lot of southern rust in 2024, the previous year as well. And so, as I told all of them, don't worry, it's not going to overwinter. You won't likely ever see this again, probably not next year for sure. Well, that ended up to not be the case, right? And so it turns out we know the southern rust fungus, or the common rust fungus for that matter, neither of them can overwinter in Nebraska. And part of that is because rust fungi have to infect and grow in living plant tissue. And so they can't survive year after year. And so a lot of the myths that I heard was, well, it's overwintering in Nebraska now, or it's overwintering in Kansas, so we're going to get more of it. And that's simply not true. And so we actually still have to look to states south of us to get an idea when it's moving our way. It didn't hurt that it was identified a little earlier this year, but mainly the conditions were extremely favorable for it to blow up on us. A second thing I heard was that people really believed that since they were seeing rust in some of our grass species, like some of the brome species, they believed that it was spreading in some of the other species of grasses. That's not true either. Rust fungi tend to have really narrow and specific host ranges, meaning they may only have one or two plants that they can infect. And furthermore, almost every plant species has one or more rust species that can infect it. And so what really was happening is that many of these rust species have similar conditions that favor them. And so at the same time that we were seeing southern rust blowing up in our corn, other similar rust diseases and pathogens were blowing up in other grasses like brome grass and some of the other grasses out there, but they weren't the same fungus. So let's put that one to rest right now. Furthermore, I heard stories about super strains of the southern rust fungus, and even that the university had discovered a super strain of the southern rust fungus. That is absolutely not true. If there was something special out there, you'd be the first to know from us. And so what really happened was that, like I mentioned earlier, the rust fungus makes its way up here every year. And honestly, 19 out of the last 20 years that I've been here, we have confirmed southern rust somewhere in Nebraska. So we're probably always getting spores pushed up here from southern locations, especially in 24 when we had that hurricane move up through the Gulf and up through the Midwest. It pushed a lot of spores and other things, as you may remember, even some insect pests up this way too. But whether or not we get disease and how bad it becomes really is determined by what's going on here in Nebraska when that fungus arrives. And this year, it was extremely favorable for disease. And so that was what happened to us this past year. And so overall, our temperatures were generally daytime temperatures less than normal. Much of Nebraska never hit 100 degrees. And then we also had high relative humidity. And I've got some information I'm going to supplement here in a bit that hopefully will help explain that. And so the high humidity and the milder daytime temperatures, the warmer nighttime temperatures that we experienced averaged around 80 degrees for prolonged periods of time, and disease blew up. And so it really depends on how long you're having those conditions, how bad disease is going to become. And here's one explanation. Many of you probably noticed that our solar radiation really was less than normal, meaning that we had a lot more cloud cover. And in some parts of the state, like up where I'm at, we had a lot of smoke cover too. We were overcast a lot of days during the months of July and even into August. And what that did is helped our relative humidity stay high. It kept our daytime temperatures down. And so that was really important for creating a really favorable environment for the southern rust fungus. And so likewise, similarly, you look at some of these maps, and I want to thank Eric Hunt. And I think he worked with Eric Snodgrass on some of these resources. And I know you've seen them in other articles and whatnot, but keep in mind too that we also had higher nighttime temperatures. And so looking at this map, you'll notice that nighttime temperatures or minimum temperatures were above average or even much above average in much of the country, including a big part of Nebraska, and helped drive more southern rust development and some other diseases that we'll talk about. And so a lot of things working against us, and we might not have even realized it while it was happening. And so when you look at 2025 as a whole, and you kind of compare it to some of the other years that we've had, southern rust certainly was at historic levels in parts of the state. In particular, it was severe in extreme eastern Nebraska, like extreme southeast Nebraska. Looking across the board at some of those years and how they rank with regard to their overall yield, corn performance, and the overall weather conditions, whether it's warm and dry in the upper left-hand corner down to cool and wet in the lower right, you can see the type of conditions that favor the corn production and yield, and some of the ones that don't. So where we had below trend some of those years. And specifically, 2025 kind of fell squarely in that warm and wet part of that graph. And so that just further solidifies that we had an extremely favorable weather year. And warm and wet is about as favorable as you can get for a disease like southern rust. And so finally, on the fourth myth, I started hearing rumors about how our fungicides weren't working in 2025. And so that's not true either. And so we have some very effective fungicides, but even our most effective fungicides just won't work if we're not doing a good job applying them. And part of that is about application timing. And unfortunately, when corn prices are low like they are, we often hesitate and kind of wait to see what's going to happen, trying to save input costs. So some people might have got them on a little bit late and too late to get good control from them. Otherwise, we also had some application quality issues. Fungicides do a good job controlling disease, but we have to get good canopy coverage and canopy penetration. And so we often this year saw patterns in the field after applications showing us that we may not have gotten the uniformity that we needed in some of those applications, or sometimes we saw disease blowing up in the lower half of the canopy when the upper half was still protected. Well, that could either be a canopy penetration issue after a fungicide application, or it could just be that at the ear leaf and below, we had more humidity and disease often developed down there first, or it just simmered down there in that lower canopy before it worked its way up in the upper canopy after conditions became more and more humid. And so there's a lot of things to consider here, but I think we've been using fungicides heavily in some areas for a lot of years, never having seen some of these effects, partly because we haven't had a disease that was severe enough until now to really expose some of the problems that we've had with applications. And so that's something I want to share. I know a lot of you have questions about how best to apply them. Our clientele do too, for sure. We get a lot of questions about, should we use airplanes to apply them, or drones, or even chemigation, which we have an interest in. And so we're interested. We want to work with those application techniques more with you. And we got to work with John Nelson this year, Mileson, and Chris and I, and we will have more data that I'll share in later slides when we have all that wrapped up. But you'll see that appear in the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network too. So this was a very atypical year though. And so almost everybody will have seen benefits from fungicide use. And it's just an example that fungicides work well and you get more benefits when you got a lot of disease. Many times I don't think we've had enough disease to see consistent benefits from fungicides. So a tough year to be talking about this. So moving forward, when you're looking for southern rust resources, a lot of the recommendations are documented and coming from the Crop Protection Network. Keep in mind, this resource is a summary from at least a dozen states of data, and that includes ours from Nebraska that go into this network. And so also the southern states where they more consistently see southern rust. And so, and some specific research out of the University of Arkansas from one of my counterparts. So these recommendations are a summary of what those experiments showed. And so you've got the website here, you'll have that in the slides, and a QR code to get you there quicker. And so these hopefully will be helpful to you looking forward. And so you also have the fungicide efficacy ratings and tables. Now, you've got that in your EC 130, the weed guide, the guide for weed disease and insect management in Nebraska. But also, those data come from the fungicide efficacy table on the Crop Protection Network every year. And so it's free there and quick to find on your phone or wherever. And it lists what we expect fungicides how to behave when we apply them for southern rust or tar spot or some of the other diseases. So that's where that all comes from. And so you can find that information there. And that's what it looks like. And this is updated annually. Most years there's not a lot of changes that happen, but you can always find the newest one. And by the time you guys are starting to use some of this content and we get into crop production clinics in January, we'll probably have a new updated efficacy table on the Crop Protection Network, usually around February. So that happens pretty early in the season. So if you got questions, please reach out to me and let me know about that. So moving on, switching topics and crops altogether, I wanted to talk just very briefly about a sorghum disease that we saw this year and may have surprised some people, but for the very same reasons that we had a lot more southern rust this year, we also saw some other diseases that may be pretty uncommon or even rare. And one of those was sorghum ergot. And this was, of course, a much bigger problem in Kansas, and it was all the way across Kansas this year. Well, we saw it too, but it came on and developed so late. Hopefully, it didn't create a big problem for most of our producers because we weren't talking about it widely. But late in the season, as we started to hear more about it in Kansas and started to look for it up here in Nebraska, we did confirm it. And so one location where I confirmed it was up here in Polk County. These pictures came from a forage sorghum, and some of the forage sorghum varieties are much more susceptible to this particular fungus, Claviceps africana. Now, the fungus infects during flowering, and if that ovule becomes infected, then that fungus continues to grow and it produces a honeydew, a sticky honeydew. And so in this head over here on the right, you can see these, it looks like amber colored droplets or kind of brown droplets scattered around in here. That's the fungus and the honeydew, and they're full of spores, and they are very attractive to insects. And so these heads stuck out to me because they had flies crawling all over them. And then when I reached over and grabbed them, they were really sticky. And in the right lighting, they kind of glittered. And so that was something that made them stand out and was a warning. On top of that, there were a lot of what looked like speckles, or it turned out to be droplets on the leaves below some of these. So looking down in the leaf canopy, a lot of these leaves looked like white droplets to tan to brown, depending on the stage they were at. Some of them were wet and sticky though, and that's where that fungus and honeydew is dripped down on those leaves. And so in the forage sorghum, honestly, in sorghum in general, we don't see sclerotia produced by this fungus. A lot of you think about ergot, and you know that in rye we have ergots much more common there, that another species. But that when those big black hard sclerotia are produced in those heads, that's a different fungus. And we don't usually see sclerotia production in sorghum ergot in Nebraska. That's also where you would see the mycotoxin, the ergot alkaloids that can be very toxic. Fortunately, though, we don't see it a lot in Nebraska, so it would be rare to find it. And so we're really not too concerned about that at all for use of feed for this sorghum that might have been infected. It's more important to be aware that the stickiness of the heads and the leaves just might make it harder to handle. And so it might explain some of the things people saw. That's not a big deal, of course, in forage sorghum. When it develops in grain sorghum, that's a bigger problem. You might remember there's some cases in 2014, even back in 2004 when I interviewed here. My first exposure to sorghum ergot were tales of awful experiences as, people harvested sorghum and the grain sat in grain carts and sat in trucks overnight. And when they came back the next day to auger it out, it was just nearly a solid brick, and they couldn't get it augered out. And it required them to mechanically chip it out of there. So it can be a big headache for our farmers to deal with. But that's sorghum ergot. And on this head on the right, you can see some more advanced pictures where a lot of that honeydew has been infected by other fungi. The saprophytic fungi are growing on there, turning some of those globules black, probably also as it's dried down a lot more too. So that's something we hope we don't see very often, but that's what's going on. And it wasn't uniform around the state. A lot of it had to do with planting date of some of these sorghum fields that affected when they flowered. And of course, whatever the conditions were when they flowered, whether or not they were favorable, if it was really humid and wet, like what we saw when we talked about corn, we had infection of some of those sorghum heads. So that's something to keep in mind too. So I've spent a lot of time talking about southern rust and even a little bit of disease in sorghum. We still need to talk about tar spot. The good news about the southern rust is it will not overwinter here. And so again, having a year like what we just experienced and so much disease is not common. It's not likely to happen again unless we have another favorable year. Tar spot is a different story though, because this fungus overwinters very effectively in Nebraska and other states where it occurs. It can't get cold enough to kill this fungus. And you'll see that because this fungus is distributed throughout many of our northernmost states like Michigan and Wisconsin too. And so it is important in Nebraska, and it's going to continue to be important, probably our biggest disease year to year as we move forward. And so we did have a lot of tar spot in 2025. It was just overshadowed by the southern rust story. And in some of those same fields, as we got later into the season, we had both. And so you can see late season what some of that debris looked like. I think most of these pictures were taken in Wheeler County. And so, that fungus has moved into the central part of the state. And you can see it on that residue too. And you're more likely to see tar spot, and especially severe tar spot, in fields where it's already been severe, much like white mold and the white mold story that Dylan tells. And so tar spot, and keeping track of the areas in your county where you're seeing more of it, that's going to continue to be a problem, and where we want to put some emphasis on identification and improved management. And so you can definitely see it in that lower left-hand corner going into the winter time. So this is the updated map from 2025. Remember that any county shaded gray means that tar spot's been confirmed there before. Counties shaded in that yellow or gold color show us where tar spot was confirmed and active that calendar season or in 2025. After the first of the year, when you visit this website, everything is going to be turned gray, because we keep track of where it's been, because it's going to reoccur when conditions are favorable. And so it's important that we continue to document where tar spot has developed. And if you've kept track of this story, it's continuing to move west further into the state. We had some out here all the way out in Custer County, out in Dawson County, and, up north into Rock and Brown counties too. And so it's probably even further west, but out on these western fringes of where disease is, it's often very light, sometimes even difficult to find. The further east you are in the state, the worse we tend to see tar spot pressure. Over time, moving forward, that will only get worse as pressure builds up, especially under irrigation pivots. And so we'll have to spend some time working with our growers, talking about that, what to watch for. And there's a lot left to learn about tar spot, but we do have some good management data behind us. And so over the last 2 years before this, many of you have been presenting some of the Purdue University fungicide trial result data from my counterpart, Darcy Tolenko. These are excellent resources. And so when we talk about fungicides applied between R1 and R3, so, from tassel emergence and pollen shed up through the milk stages, that's the most effective time to control tar spot. Even when we see tar spot development in really young plants, like we did this year in 25 at V6. So management is not necessary during that time, at least in those trials in those states east of us. And if you remember back to that old data set, you've got it, at least access to it, either straight from me or in the in-service presentations from the last 2 years. This is the main slide telling that story. And so in the green box, you see VTR1 up through milk. You can see in the red bars at what level tar spot was when the fungicide was applied. And we know based on this data set that as long as you spray a fungicide before tar spot is greater than 5 or 6% on the ear leaf, and so that's what we're seeing right here, tar spot just on the ear leaf. And so red bar here increasing from the blister to the milk and then up to the dough stages. Fungicides applied VTR1 to R3 did the best job controlling it and slowing it down. Once tar spot got greater than 6% on that ear leaf, they had a hard time getting ahead of it with those later fungicide applications, especially if that was during dough or later. And so at this time, we're not recommending applications past that time point. And most of our best fungicides are going to provide us 3 weeks of protection. And so some locations applied a lot more fungicides than they needed, whether some of that, of course, for southern rust, but some was for tar spot too. And so well-timed fungicides I bet this year that we didn't need it more than a couple of times, even in the very worst areas. And so these are difficult messages when we have people with opposing messages to what we're trying to share. But this is your background, this is your data set that we're basing that off of. And if you need that whole data set again, we can go through that or talk about it personally. So please give me a call. And if people say, well, what does 5% or 6% look like? That's that picture in the upper right-hand corner. And you can generate these pictures on the Crop Protection Network to help train your eye on how to recognize how much disease is out there. Again, though, most of the worst disease is going to be in those irrigated fields. We've known that for a long time. Overhead irrigation really drives it because the tar spot fungus is dependent on the environmental conditions like microclimate conditions. And Talon Muse, extension educator, instructor out in the state, he has done a lot of that work for his master's thesis. And look for some more content from Talon and supplemental video. And also, we want to work with people and conduct more trials around the state as part of the On-Farm Research Network, working with Talon, but also with my new student, Cole Black, because Cole Black is picking up part of the research that where Talon left off. And we want to look at the use of chemigation for management of tar spot and applying fungicides. And so we're looking for cooperators that would be interested in working with us and trying that out. And we have several different trial scenarios and layouts and can adapt those according to what the producers want to try and what they're willing to work with. And so we'd love to gather some more data on that, especially in other parts of the state, because there's still uncertainty on what to expect from tar spot as it keeps going west. And is it slowing down? Is it how far west can it go? We don't know the answers to that. So we have work left to do, and we want to work with you on that too. So watch for those videos in this in-service presentation. Also, I want to put in a plug for crown rot. This is another disease, and we haven't talked much about it these last few years because tar spot's been such a big deal, and now southern rust has been a big problem for us. But crown rot is an important disease in Nebraska too. And I want to acknowledge the Nebraska Corn Board and Bayer Crop Science for sponsoring a lot of research over the last 3 or actually more years, because we've made a lot of progress in learning more about crown rot, because this is a disease that's much more widespread than many people realize, because it's often misdiagnosed as stalk rot or something else. And we misunderstood. We really don't even know which pathogen or pathogens are causing it. And so check out some of the additional resources from my 2 other students, Chris Tremundi, who's an extension instructor starting in January in Phelps County in that area, and Chakoti Makuma, a PhD student in my team too. So listen to them talk about crown rot, learn more about it. This has been a bigger problem in the western counties of Nebraska, but it is statewide, actually across the Corn Belt. And listen to them talk about that. There's also a video webinar on the crown rot disease. And crown rot of corn, there's a party going on. And so my counterpart, Allison Robertson from Iowa State, and I talk about crown rot. This is about a year old, but talking about some of the research data that both of our lab teams have been working on. So there are a lot of resources out there for you. And if you're getting a lot of concern about diseases in your counties, please reach out to me and our team members and let us help provide resources to help you better combat what's going on locally. We so appreciate the work you're doing. There's lots of resources out there available to you. Hopefully I've outlined some of those from our own Crop Watch pages, Market Journal, and of course the Crop Protection Network. In this slide set, you're going to have a lot more slides to work with. I'm going to cut off my presentation here. And as you scroll through and look at some of these slides, you're going to notice we have a lot of fungicide data from locations in Nebraska, like the South Central Ag Lab at Clay Center in the south central part of the state, but also the Haskell Ag Lab in the northeast part of the state and near Concord. And so as you scroll through there, take a look at what those look like. Just know this is a draft I'm putting in your hands right now. We are still crunching a lot of these numbers and making the slides prettier, a little bit easier to read in bigger rooms and crowds. And so I'll be providing updated versions of that in our content on SharePoint. And so I also want to acknowledge my team members. None of this work would happen if I didn't have these awesome people working with me, like Brad Tarnish, my lab manager, research manager, Cole Black, who's in a technical role right now, who will be a graduate student starting soon this winter. And then, of course, we've got Talon Muse is still a student in the lab too. He's also been working as an instructor now for more than a year. And we'll join him soon is Chris Tremundi out there and Chakoti Makuma. So thank you all so very much. Take a look at these results. Ask any questions you've got. And thank you for the work you do. I look forward to continuing our work with you. Best wishes and happy holidays. Thank you.